Thanks very much for the opportunity, Wilf. And obviously today we've released the What We Heard report. The objective behind that is to try and put forward some of the views that are contained in the 2,470 submissions that we received. Put that into some sort of context, 4.5 million words. That's 10 times War and Peace. And we have actually read every one. Can't say that I've read everyone myself, but we have actually been through a process, and it's been an incredibly valuable exercise. But I think it's because that's what water deserves, and that's what the process deserves. People are deeply passionate about water. They're deeply passionate about the basin, and that's simply because it really matters. And what I can tell you is through those 2,470 submissions, for every person that said we need to stop water recovery by way of buybacks, there were equal groups that said we need to recover more by buybacks. For every person that said the sustainable diversion limits should not be touched and represent an environmentally sustainable level of take, there was someone that said they don't. And that's good. I mean, that's the process of public policy, and that's the process of debate. And I think the process deserves that. Fair to say, I think we've been at this a long time. The first cap and diversions was in 1995. There was the National Water Initiative in 2004, the Water Act in 2007, the Basin Plan in 2012, establishment of the sustainable diversion limits in 2017, water resource plans, some of which are still outstanding in 2019. So the process rolls on. So it's really important, this process of review. To give you some sense of the process of review, we've actually been at the Basin Plan review for some 3 years. It started with the Basin Plan evaluation and then rolled into the Basin Plan outlook and related to that, the Sustainable Rivers Audit and the Sustainable Yield Study, which was a rearward look, how we've gone, a forward look at the basin under climate change, and then of course the discussion paper and now the What We Heard report. The basis of the What We Heard report, as I say, 2,470 submissions. Thank you to all of you who made submissions. I was just chatting to Emma before. We got a lot of people describing the problem, probably not so many people describing solutions, but we did actually get a lot of solutions. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, that the thinking of the authority has been shifted by what we're seeing in the submissions process. And so we roll on from here. Just quickly, the consultation process, we were on the road for 12 weeks. I think collectively we travelled about 150,000 kilometres. We visited 100 towns. We met with just over 3,000 people and we had, I think, 326 different engagements. So I think we've got a sense of what people are saying, and that's really important. I guess, the challenge for the authority now is what we do with that in terms of policy positions. Our intention is to lodge the review with the government on the 9th of December. And I think it's an important point here, Wilf, is that I guess that's not the end of the dance. There'll be a process where the government then has to take that review and consider that in the context of 6 other pieces of review that are going on at the present point in time. And I guess that's been one of the things that's come out, is there's lots of reviews going on. There's a review of the Inspector General. There's been the review of the WESA Fund. There's the review of the Water Act. There's a review of the Basin Plan. There's a review of the National Water Initiative. And I probably missed a few in there as well. There's 7 altogether. So people are tired. But I think the focus will ultimately come down to the Water Act review and what that looks like. So I guess one of the things I'd say is, we will deliver this to the government, and then we will be on the bus like the rest of you in terms of what the government might do with that. So the dance is not finished once we deliver, but hopefully we can deliver something that reflects a lot of what we've heard.
Thanks, Andrew. You're an excellent guest, and I think well placed to conduct this review because you've answered the question before I asked it. It was fantastic. Can I ask the obvious question from today's lunch is, what have you heard in terms of some summaries? I'm sure you'll get some particular questions on particular issues, but at a broad brushstroke, 14 years on, what have you heard?
I guess the first and most important thing is, Wilf, that no one, not one submission, and look, I didn't read 2,470, I probably read about 150 of them. But to my knowledge, not one submission said we don't need a plan for the basin. And I think that's really significant. I was in Brazil last week, and I'll tell you what, they really need a plan for their basins. And so I think that's really significant. So there's broad public acceptance that the Basin Plan matters and that we need some sort of system to manage that. I think also communities consistently told us that they want to be heard and that there's a real frustration in communities that to date they haven't been heard. I was at a meeting, I'm just trying to think where it was, might have been Cowra, and a lovely lady, I think she might have been from the CWA, bless her, she said to me, this is the first time someone's turned up from government and actually listened to us. And I think that's really important. So that sort of came out. In terms of common areas, improving water quality, hugely important. The way in which water for the environment is used. So whether you agree whether enough water has been recovered for the environment, making sure that water for the environment is really well used, and that goes to the role of the Commonwealth Environment Water Holder and the flexibility that they have. It goes to a bunch of things around complementary measures as well, but making sure that water is really well used. Native fish. Native fish are people get extraordinarily passionate about fish. And I think there was a high degree of consensus that there's more that needs to be done. There's debate around what needs to be done, but a high degree of consensus that we need to do more to improve outcomes for native fish. Increasing First Nations involvement. Again, debate around what that might look like, but I think capturing that knowledge of First Nations people, particularly in environmental water planning, I think is important, and recognising First Nations science as legitimate, which of course it is, and so wanting to make sure that that's the case, and that sort of collective involvement in decision making, that was really clear across all of the submissions. What I would see with the Basin Plan is that we're going to be moving to what I would call a much more place-based approach, and the solutions being developed working with communities, whether that be environment groups, down in Catarapco, or whether it be irrigation groups in the Namoy, or whether it be First Nation groups in St George, making sure that those groups are included in the sorts of solutions. And we saw some of that, and I think that will be where we go. So that sort of collective involvement and decision making. So that's where the collective sort of good news was. Where are the points of difference? Quite clearly on sustainable diversion limits. We had very strong feedback that sustainable diversion limits should not be touched, and we had very strong feedback that sustainable diversion limits need to be adjusted. We had debate as to whether sustainable diversion limits should, as they do at the moment, under the legislation, represent an environmentally sustainable level of take, or should they be included to represent other things as well? So some challenges in there in terms of the Water Act as well. Climate adaptation, so there was really strong agreement that climate change is very real, but the responses to climate change, how do we adapt? Do you change the SDLs? Is that your response to climate change? Do you look at integrated catchment management? Is that your response? So quite different responses to climate change adaptation, but collective views around the importance of climate change. And I think this piece around balancing the sort of environment, community, agriculture, one of the big pieces of criticism was what people called the missing chapter. There wasn't strong enough recognition in the discussion paper of the contribution of agriculture to the outcomes of the basin. So how do we make sure in basin planning and the future of the Basin Plan that we're recognising the contributions of different parts of the community, and what's the role of the Basin Plan versus other things? So quite a deal of, I'd suggest, difference in there, Wilf. Yeah.
You mentioned provision of your report to government in December, but in terms of the next steps between now and then, and indeed mindful of the other reviews that are underway, where do we go from here, Andrew?
Fair to say, we got a lot of advice on what we need to do next. And look, it's hard, right? No matter what we do, we're going to upset someone in the process. In fact, it reminds me, when I was appointed to this role by Keith Pitt, the then Minister for Water, Keith approached me a couple of times about this job, and I sort of knocked him back, and then I said yes. And then I said to him, what does success look like? And he said, if everyone hates you equally at the end of it, you've done a good job. And that's pretty much where we're landing, I think. So what are we going to do from here? So the report comes out, it's on the website today. The submissions are being loaded over the course of today. It's a bit of a task to load a couple of thousand submissions, but they'll all be there. We'll do a public webinar on the What We Heard report in the next couple of weeks. We'll then continue our work on developing the policy positions that come from the input we've got. We'll look to do some very direct engagement with what I would call peaks, probably in September, and making sure that we get those groups together through probably some sort of roundtable series. We're still trying to work this through, but and that'll dive into probably the 5 or 6 key areas. I'd expect we'll then do another round of public webinars, looking at some of the direction we're landing on before delivering that to government. To cut the question off at the path, some people have said we should put out a draft report. We're not going to put out a draft report. I think through the consultation processes we've undertaken, plus what we'll do, I think we'll be able to signal clearly enough where we're going, and our focus is on making sure that we deliver something that's really credible to government. I think one of the things with that is it's been quite unique, the process that we've gone through to get to this point. I can't think of any other government submission or government review process that's done what we've done. So my sense is we've got a pretty good handle on where we're going. And so, we'll do a series of public webinars. And then, of course, we've got to continue to engage with the states. So we'll do all of that. And our goal is to deliver a review to the government by the 9th of December. And then the government will obviously take that and determine what its response is. I guess the last point I'd make there, Wilf, is this is a little bit unique in government review processes. It's not like a Productivity Commission review where the PC gives it to the government and the government says thanks very much and then sits on it for 3 months to work out its response. When we give the review to the government, it's public.
One more question from me, and going to a more targeted question before we open up to the floor. Revealing sort of my interest in this, I've been involved with a few submissions involved with water quality and also broader landscape restoration. Often a criticism of the Water Act, the whole water framework in Australia, is that it only deals with water and not those associated land uses, quality. It's very much, SDLs is about volume, not water quality. You mentioned water quality earlier. I suppose that the question really is what you've heard on broader, sort of not volumetric, but quality landscape repair issues, but also, as a second part, we've discussed this separately, but what role the MDBA has given the governance framework is state-based.
Yeah, so water quality comes up repeatedly. It's one of the key issues in the submissions itself. And when we talk about water quality, it depends where you are in the basin. In the north, it's often about drinking water quality and sort of algal blooms. In the south, it's more algal blooms than drinking water quality. But the things driving water quality, salinity, chemical loads, cold water pollution, algal blooms and the like, sedimentation. In terms of the response, really frankly, the Basin Plan doesn't have a lot of levers it can pull. I think what we need to do is highlight that it's an issue. I think what we can do is broaden the suite of indicators around water quality so it starts to get people focused on other things. Largely the Basin Plan focused on salinity, and we've actually been really successful in managing salinity and getting salinity levels down through the salt interception schemes and the like. But we need a broader set of sort of drivers. So that's one thing we can do in the Basin Plan. I think in terms of the land management piece, absolutely. Where are the improvements in water quality come? How do you manage the riverine environment? Can you prevent stock from getting down and drinking from the river? So you prevent bank slumping. Can you deal with invasive species? Can you start to restore snags and reed beds and the like, those natural filters in the river system? Can you look at ways in which you slow the movement of water down across the landscape? So changing your land management practices, particularly in the upper catchments. They are largely state-based functions. I think in Victoria, the catchment management authorities have done a pretty good job. I think here in New South Wales, it's been more challenging with sort of land care and local land services in terms of how that has worked together or not. I think that the authority will be pointing to the importance of those activities continuing and perhaps the need for investment in that to support these local solutions. What we see with water quality and particularly fish is that, you need a set of overriding principles, but you've got to respond locally. And I think the ability to respond locally is going to be really important. The challenge with that, of course, is that, and this is the challenge with water generally, a a lot of the funding for water comes from the federal government. The execution is with the state government. In the case of water quality, drinking water, it's local governments. And so you get this sort of complex arrangement where the money might not get to where it needs to be. And I guess that's one of the challenges for the Commonwealth government as it goes forward, is how does it want to continue to invest in improving those things, and what are the management frameworks that support that? And I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge. What can the MDBA do? The last part of your question, Wolf. Look, the honest thing is we can just shine a light on it to say this continuously comes up. Here's some things we think you could do. We can set some broad parameters as to sort of the outcomes that we think need to be achieved for water quality, but execution is absolutely a state-based problem. And that's really the problem with water. It's not the problem, it's just a challenge. Water is a state function. Under the Constitution, it's a state function. The Basin Plan and the Water Act and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, actually our predominant existence is by virtue of the government's international commitments to Ramsar. So, there's a lot of complexity in there in terms of how we exercise influence. But I think what we've got through the submissions process is some credibility to say, actually, these things really matter to community. And here's some of the things that we think you collectively as states and maybe the Commonwealth want to choose to invest in.
I'm sure the water lawyers in the room were thrilled you mentioned the Constitution. Thank you, Andrew. We might move to questions from the audience. The Get Up banner hasn't unfurled yet, so I might ask that you at least, when you ask your question, note the organisation that you're affiliated with, so Andrew can moderate his response accordingly. And please try... And please try to ask a question and give a statement.
Thank you, Andrew. Graham Kruger from the Rice Growers Association of Australia, representing proudly the rice industry, which does a fabulous job, in spite of what some others may think. But thank you, just Andrew, a comment first and a question. I just want to acknowledge and appreciate the summits and the leadership summits where you drew together across the whole spectrum of interests around the Basin Plan, and I certainly enjoyed the interaction that I had, and from my sense there was a lot of, I sensed more common ground than dissension, and I would be interested to see if one could take the bell curve of all the submissions and actually focus on the common ground instead of what is the focus of what is we disagree on. And I, in particular, would call out somebody sitting on completely the opposite side of the spectrum, and out of the 7 points that we were discussing, 5 of them we agreed on at one of those summits and the one in Brisbane. So just sort of ask for your comments on what is the common ground amongst the disparate views and voices in the basin.
Thanks, Graham. Look, I think the first thing is, irrespective of your views of whether further water recovery is required, and that is very hotly contested, making sure that whatever water we have is used really well. So when we talk about using water well, what does that mean? It means we need to actively use the environmental water portfolio, and there are, I think, things that we can do and that we've learnt. The timing of environmental water, the capacity of the Commonwealth Environment Water Holder to perhaps be more active in the use of the portfolio, looking at ways in which you can manage the delivery of water with other environmental events, looking at some of the infrastructure barriers, barriers to fish passage, again, really, really important, improving on-farm management, integrated catchment management, all of those sort of use water well. Absolutely no dispute around any of that, and the importance of simplistically what we call complementary measures. Now, there's a comment, and I think it's highlighted in one of the slides I got for the general sort of coverage of the What We Heard report. People say, yep, complementary measures, but others say, but that shouldn't be a substitute for water recovery. And I get that. Others will say, no, that has to be the answer. But the use of environmental water really well, I think, is important. I think the importance of First Nations and recognising the importance of First Nations knowledge, again, no dispute there. There's questions that get brought up in terms of, well, what's the impact of the First Nations sort of water portfolio, and what does that mean? And again, different views there, but use and collecting of that knowledge is really important. I think basin-wide sensible responses to fish, making sure fish are a bit like the sort of aqua equivalent of the canary in the coal mine. Fish aren't well, it tends to suggest that the health of the basin isn't well. What are the things that get in the way? Water quality, absolutely. That's another thing that people are universally concerned about. Again, different responses to how you might respond, but the need to deal with water quality. And that flows through to fish passage, infrastructure, fish screens, making sure that you're giving the opportunity for events to occur, that universal. Dealing with invasive species, carp. Everyone talks about carp. Interestingly, not everyone agrees that the carp herpes virus is the answer. Some people say, actually, no, there's real risks with that, but if you can strengthen the performance of your native fish, they might be able to outcompete. But dealing with invasive species and the health of that riverine environment. So very, very strong agreement across those three areas. The fourth one, Graham, I'd say, is simplification. It is a very complex tool. Sitting on my desk in my office in Canberra, 980 pages of legislation. It's complex. Water resource planning, really complex. Lots of debate around what a water resource plan should look like. Could it be the accreditation of a state instrument? Should it be something different? I think the weight of evidence is probably something different. Fair to say there are concerns about how much do we trust the states to do what they say they're going to do, just being frank. The role of the Inspector General, giving them the tools to do what they need to do, really important. So simplification of water resource plans in whatever way that might occur, again, almost universal agreement that needs to happen.
Helen Dalton, Independent Member for Murray. Farmers and communities are in the environment. Why did you choose to leave out the issues around the social and economics that rural ag communities have continued to raise with you in the lead up to the discussion paper that was left out? The same issue was raised when the Insights paper was released and communities were told it would be included and addressed in this discussion paper. So what's your response to that?
Thanks, Helen. Happy to absolutely cop on the chin. We should have said more about what some people describe as the missing chapter in terms of the contribution to and the impacts of the Basin Plan and agriculture in the discussion paper. That was a miss on our part, and I'm very, very happy to own that. The thinking behind it, whether you agree with it or not, was that it was a series of interventions over 2 years that led to the discussion paper. So the Basin Plan evaluation, which looked extensively at the performance of the Basin Plan, the impact of the Basin Plan on communities and the productivity of agriculture, and then also looking at the Basin Outlook as to what might happen in terms of the impact of the Basin Plan and climate change on agriculture. So the thinking was that they were, for want of a better term, a box set in bringing them together. But of course, people read what's in front of them, and they read what was in front of them with the discussion paper, and it didn't acknowledge to the extent that it should have, the importance of agriculture, communities, and the impact of the Basin Plan on communities. So that was a miss on our part, Helen. We had a logic there, but the logic didn't transcribe in the way that we thought it might. Of course, the opportunity for us is, as we look to the review, making sure that we are very transparent and open, and you'll see when you read the What We Heard report, we're very, very open about the criticism that we've received in that space. We talk about the missing chapter and making sure that as we go forward and deliver the review, that the contributions of tourism, of agriculture, irrigated agriculture, dryland agriculture, the importance of environmental tourism, the importance of the environment, all of these things need to be acknowledged in the same way. So happy to take the criticism, Helen, and I think we've learnt from that process.
Hey, Andy. Andrew Marshall from the Land newspaper. Pauline Hanson says we should be making sure that our water is owned by Australians and that we should be tying it back with land. How possible is it to walk back on that? How realistic is that thought, if it is going to be policy with an up-and-coming political party?
Sure. I think the short answer is, Andrew, I don't think that genie's going to be put back in the bottle. I think there's a lot of positives that have come from the ability to create water markets. Water markets exist on the fact that you're able to separate land from water. I'll come to the foreign investment question second. In terms of water markets, as I say, I was literally in Brazil last week and met with a whole range of people over there. And there is a bill before the Parliament in Brazil at the moment that the agriculture industry, which is booming in Brazil, for anyone who know Brazil, but they will be able to have unfettered access to water with no limits. And of course, they have to pay for it, but there's no water market in the sense that we have a water market here in Australia. And fair to say, the government is very concerned, and I think the concern is genuine and real. I think the importance of water markets comes to the ability to actually provide water to different uses. The fact that we've been able to step back from a situation with the Basin Plan that I don't think anyone disagrees that in 2007, when the Water Act was put in place, that the basin was teetering on the edge of something that might not be recovered. And I think it's an incredible achievement, an absolutely incredible achievement to get to where we are now, where the basin is actually in pretty good health. And that's been possible because we've been able to allocate water to different uses, including for the environment. It's cost the government a lot of money, as it should. Water's an expensive and valuable asset, but it's enabled water to be used for different purposes. You do get into interesting questions around land use planning and the like, but I think the functioning of water markets has supported the ability to make sure that we have water for the environment, water for communities, water for industry, and I think that's a very important outcome. And I think governments across the country are very committed to it. And I wouldn't see, Andrew, that that's going to change in any way. And sitting as I do in my position, I wouldn't want to see that change because I think it gives us the mechanism to achieve a whole range of outcomes for the health of the basin. And we should never lose sight of the fact that the basin and the Basin Plan has as its objective a healthy working basin for all Australians. And there's a lot in those words. It's healthy, it's working, and it's basin-wide, and I think the markets underpin that. The question of foreign capital in markets, and people get very, I've been around agriculture for a long time, people get very agitated and invested, excuse the pun, in foreign investment in agriculture. What's really interesting is actually those foreign entities that own entitlements to the water market actually tend to hang on to them, much more so than perhaps more domestic players, because water is a very valuable asset and it generates a significant return. And I do think it is important that you do have liquidity, you have counterparty risk, that's being able to be met in the market. And so I think we'd want to be cautious around that. Markets should be able to work. Will they always deliver the outcomes that you want? Possibly not. But is it better than the alternative? I'd say definitely so. And I think those players in the market engage responsibly, and there are a range of checks and balances in the system through the Foreign Investment Review Board, through the nature of the markets and the way they work, that I think should give people confidence around that situation. So I get people get emotional about it, I really do. I've been around ag long enough to know that, but equally I think the net benefit of markets, the creation of the separation of land from water, and having vehicles that allow investment, I think, has probably benefited the basin more than it has hindered the development of the basin and its health.
Thank you, Andrew. Stephen Wentworth, Feeding the Future Consulting and Research. If one of the objectives is a healthier Coorong, perhaps there should be less focus on forcing water through the system and restoring pathways which naturally occurred historically. So rather than concentrating on solely increasing flows through the Murray mouth, should we be asking a different question? How do we deliver fresh water to the head of the Coorong areas around Tilly Swamp and allow nature to take its course, which has been identified in Colin Field's Storm Boy, water moved from the head of the Coorong to the mouth?
So, the Coorong is obviously a big focus of the Basin Plan, and there are specific objectives around what was intended to be achieved there. I think it's absolutely right and pertinent to ask the question, can you continue to achieve those objectives? And that's part of the review process we're in at the moment, and we've got a wide range of views as to whether they are being achieved or not. I think it's important to remember the Basin Plan, as it is framed at the moment, has particular requirements that the sustainable diversion limits must at all times represent an environmentally sustainable level of take. That's the legislative framework. I think the question, Stephen, that you ask is also, what else can be done to support that? Can we look at, we know a lot more about how flows in the Coorong work, particularly in the Southern Lagoon now. Are there other things that we need to be doing? I think that's a very legitimate question to be asked. I think people tend to get very fixated on this idea of forcing water out through the mouth of the Murray. That is absolutely not the case. What we're trying to do is ensure that a system is healthy from top to bottom, and there are objectives that have been set to try and meet that. I think it is valid, absolutely. We've got to question whether those objectives can continue to be achieved. The SDL analysis shows us, the preliminary work that we've done, that the health of the Coorong is not where it needs to be. And I think the response to that will be a combination of things. So yes, it'll be flows and flow volumes, but it'll also be looking at the operation of the barrages. How does that work? If we can deal with some of the capacity constraints further upstream of South Australia, does that also help as well? So again, I think in the same way that folks might fixate on the Coorong as either the problem or the beneficiary, I think we've got to step back and say, what's the system's response to the health of the Coorong, and what are the other things that we need to be doing? Can we look at ways in which we can create more capacity? Can we look at ways in which the timing of flows works better? Given what we now understand with particularly the flows into the Southern Lake, are there engineering solutions that might support that as well? So I think it's going to be a range of responses. It's not just about saying, here's the answer, it's increased flows. It's going to be a combination of things. And it's also got to be a legitimate asking of the question, which I think is where you were going to, Stephen. Are those objectives right? And I think more broadly, what I'd say is as the climate changes and as it becomes more variable and as it becomes warmer, there are going to be a series of hard questions that are having to be asked through these processes of Basin Plan review. Do the objectives that we once held, do they still hold? Are they still relevant? Is that what society still wants to achieve? And again, we've got a range of views from one end of the spectrum to the other. That's why the process of review is so important, to force us to ask those questions. Some of those things will need to be dealt with now. Some of those things might be things that we can deal with in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, and that's why we have a process of 10-year review. But absolutely, we've got to have the courage to ask the question, do those objectives still hold? And the Coorong is one that we're really looking closely at.
Thanks, Ben. Alan Hoppy, I'm the chair of the Almond Board of Australia. My wife told me not to talk, but once again I'll go against her wishes. I've spent 40-odd years running operational irrigation farms in Australia. Spent also 3 years running farms in Brazil. And during that time have seen a decline of rural communities, and particularly that, to me, that's been exacerbated since the buyback of water. And what it concerns me, I guess, is that you do have a missing chapter in that you're not looking at, I guess, the cost to those communities of these buybacks. And to me, it's like a patient giving blood at the Red Cross. Giving a little bit of blood is probably a good thing, and that blood can be used for greater benefit. But at some point, you need to be checking the patient's blood pressure, because you're going to take too much. And I think we're getting close to the point where you're taking too much. So the Almond Board was one of those submissions, and I would ask you to read that one in particular. I think they did a pretty good job. But I look forward to, I guess, the next phase, and hope the outcome is one where the patient gets a little bit more care.
No, thanks, Alan, and I have read the Almond Board submission, and Tim and the crew have done a really good job there. Look, I think it comes back to this sort of starting premise of making sure that you're using what you've got really well. That's really important. There is absolutely no doubt that communities have suffered, particularly strongly irrigation-dependent communities, parts of the Southern Basin, and then you get up Durham Bandy and others. And I think my hope, my intent is one of balance. And like so many things in government, pendulums tend to swing too far. I think we've got an opportunity to maybe reset some of the balance. I think we've got to continue to challenge ourselves to make sure that we are achieving the outcomes of the plan, which is an environmentally sustainable level of take under a set of limits that represent something that can work for not only the environment but for industry and for communities. And I think as a general observation, the analysis tells us that we're there or thereabouts. I mean, 109 SDLs, only 11 we've identified at risk. Now, some people have challenged that, rightly so, but that says that on the whole, the plan is working. I think from the authority's perspective, we need to carefully consider, if we're looking at changes, that we fully understand and recognise the impact on irrigation-dependent communities, but communities more broadly. I mean, had a great chat with Paul Serra, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Sunrise a couple of weeks ago, and Paul made the point, and I think it's very valid, is that when water is recovered from the community, the farmer involved takes the proceeds of that, reinvests, becomes a dryland farmer, or retires or what have you. But the impact on communities needs to be considered more broadly, and I think that's very valid and very true. And the reality to date is that the Basin Plan hasn't had the level of nuance or granularity to be able to effectively do that. And I think what we've got to do is make sure that in our work that we at least identify that these are challenges and where do we need to do more work to better understand that. Very, very much so. We understand really well where water flows and where water goes. We haven't had the level of granularity to understand, I think, to the degree that we need to, the full impact on communities. And there's a range of reasons behind that. I can absolutely assure you, given where I come from, it's not because I don't care. It's just that it's very challenging. But we've got to understand that connectivity, and I think that's one of the things the authority is very focused on. And that's why the authority is also making sure that it is being very, very considered in any decisions that it'll be looking to make to change objectives, look at SDLs, how you're using environmental water, to make sure that we're considering, yes, the environment, absolutely, but also the social, economic and cultural impacts of that. And I think that's the opportunity before us in the review, and I want to assure all of you those voices have come through really, really loudly, Alan, and I think, I can give you the assurance that the authority is hearing it loud and clear. Yeah.
Thank you to Andrew and to Wilf. You take your seats, gentlemen, and enjoy your dessert. It gives me a great pleasure to invite Paul Dello, our esteemed committee member and GHD representative, to give a formal vote of thanks.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Andrew, for your time today. I was going to also crack a joke about a Get Up banner dropping down or something similar, because we are a broad church here today with maybe a few people in both spectrum, but we're probably a bit more mature than the press club in Canberra. But thanks to Andrew today for your insights and also for launching the What We Heard report here as part of the review of the Basin Plan at the New South Wales Rural Press Club today. Obviously, as you discussed in that 12-week consultation period with 2,470 submissions, you heard areas where stakeholders have seen both alignment and divergence as you step back and assess the outcomes of the Basin Plan. So thank you very much for your presentation today. Obviously, you've got a lot of challenges there and competing pressures, looking at improving ecological systems, supporting basin industries and communities, and then also within that adapting to a changing climate. So we recognise these are very complex issues, and regardless of views, I think everyone in the room here recognises the importance of a healthy and sustainable basin. At GHD, we've had a long history working with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and within that we've looked at engineering solutions for a number of the major rivers and tributaries, to fish passages, environmental approvals, strategic planning advice, and obviously been very fortunate to assist MWBA and the state government agencies with projects from Menindee Lakes right along the Guada, Murray, Murrumbidgee and Darling rivers. So thanks again to Andrew today for coming down to Sydney and speaking to us. Thanks also to the New South Wales Rural Press Club and the committee for hosting and organising today. And obviously it's a big year for the New South Wales Rural Press Club, being the 60th year, and GHD's very happy to continue to support the great work this committee does and this organisation does. So thanks to Andrew and thanks to everyone for attending.